Story number 1. The Isolated House. I still remember the day we decided to leave the chaos of the city behind and seek tranquility in the rural expanses of Maine. My wife, Sarah, and our 2 children, Emily and Jack, were yearning for a fresh start. A place where the noise of traffic and the constant buzz of urban life could be replaced by the serene whispers of nature. That's how we found ourselves standing before the old Whitmore house, its weathered facade cloaked in ivy and shadows beneath the towering pines. The real estate agent had painted a picture of peace and solitude. But as we approached the house, an unsettling feeling settled in my stomach. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves permeating the atmosphere. The house stood isolated, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to close in around us, muffling the sounds of the outside world. "We've worked hard for this," Sarah said, squeezing my hand as we stepped through the creaking gate. The driveway was overgrown, the path to the front door barely visible beneath the encroaching vegetation. We exchanged nervous glances before pushing open the heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the house was a relic of a bygone era. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and the wooden floors creaked under our weight. Dust particles danced in the beams of sunlight streaming through the large windows, creating an eerie stillness that hung in the air. Despite the initial unease, there was an undeniable charm to the place, a sense of history and stories waiting to be uncovered. Over the next few weeks, we settled into our new home, each of us finding our own way to adapt. Emily and Jack reveled in exploring the sprawling backyard, their laughter echoing through the trees, while Sarah and I worked on making the house our own. But as the days turned into nights, strange occurrences began to disrupt our peace. It started subtly, a misplaced item here, an unexplained shadow there. We dismissed them as the quirks of an old house, the result of settling foundations and natural creaks. But then, one stormy night, everything changed. The rain pounded against the windows with a ferocity I hadn't experienced before. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and lightning cast fleeting, harsh lights across the darkened rooms. We were gathered in the living room, trying to enjoy a rare moment of relaxation, when a series of loud, deliberate knocks echoed from the front door. "Did you hear that?" Jack asked, his voice trembling slightly. Sarah nodded, her eyes darting towards the door. "Probably just the wind," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. I stood up, the unease deepening in my chest. "I'll check it out," I offered, making my way to the door. As I approached, the knocking continued, insistent and rhythmic, as if someone were desperate to get in. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door, expecting to see a drenched traveler seeking shelter. Instead, there was nothing but the relentless rain and darkness. Confused, I closed the door, turning to find Sarah and the kids looking at me with worried expressions. "Maybe it was just the wind," I suggested, though my own doubts lingered. But that night, the knocks returned, louder and more aggressive. It was as if someone or something was trying to force their way into our home. Fear gnawed at me, the protective instinct kicking in. I decided to investigate further, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. We cautiously made our way to the basement, the stairs descending into the darkness below. The basement had always been off-limits, its purpose unclear. As we reached the bottom, the sound of dripping water echoed through the space, mingling with the distant rumble of thunder. I reached for the flashlight, illuminating the damp concrete walls and old storage boxes stacked haphazardly. As we ventured deeper, Sarah noticed something, a faint, eerie scratching sound coming from behind a large, covered object in the corner. "What's that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I approached the object, pulling back the dusty sheet to reveal a hidden door carved into the wall. The door was old, the wood warped and swollen from years of neglect. My heart raced as I reached out to touch it, the scratching sound growing louder, more frantic. "Should we open it?" Emily asked, clutching Jack's hand tightly. Before I could respond, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a narrow passageway leading into the darkness. A gust of cold air swept past us, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay and something else, something ancient and malevolent. Against my better judgment, I stepped into the passage. Sarah close behind me. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in around us. We followed the corridor, the scratching now turning into desperate clawing sounds. The walls seemed to close in, the space becoming more oppressive with each step. Finally, we reached a small, hidden room. The door slammed shut behind us, the sound reverberating through the confined space. We turned on the flashlight, revealing scratch marks etched deep into the walls, as if something had been desperately trying to escape. "Look at these," I said, my voice shaking. They were dragged along the walls. Sarah shivered, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened here?" Before I could answer, a low growl echoed through the room, sending chills down my spine. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form barely distinguishable against the bleak walls. It stood over 6 feet tall, its presence exuding a palpable sense of rage and sorrow. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to steady my voice despite the terror gripping me. The figure let out a blood-curdling roar, lunging towards us with supernatural speed. We stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor, plunging us into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, desperately trying to find some semblance of light. In the brief flashes of lightning outside, I caught glimpses of the figure, a grotesque visage twisted with anguish. It reached out with clawed hands, the sounds of its tortured howls filling the room. I grabbed Sarah, pulling her towards the hidden door, the figure's presence looming ominously behind us. "We have to get out of here," I shouted, my voice hoarse with fear. We raced back through the corridor, the room behind us seemingly alive with the spirit's wrath. The passageway twisted and turned, disorienting us as the scratching sounds intensified. Just when I thought we couldn't run any further, we burst out of the basement, slamming the door shut behind us. Breathing heavily, we stood in the living room, the storm now abating but the fear lingering. The scratches on the basement wall seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a reminder of the horrors we had uncovered. We decided to leave the house, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we packed our belongings in haste, a neighbor stopped by, concern etched on his face. "I heard about the old Whitmore house," he began hesitantly. "People around here say it's cursed. They say a man was held there, accused of witchcraft, and he died alone in that basement. Some believe his spirit still haunts the place, seeking vengeance or release." The revelation hit me like a ton of bricks. The man suspected of witchcraft, was that who we had encountered? The scratch marks and the malevolent presence seemed to confirm the stories whispered among the locals. We didn't want to leave, but the fear of what lingered in the house was too great to ignore. That night, we drove away from the Whitmore house, the storm finally giving way to a calm, eerie silence. As we passed by the old mansion one last time, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure watching us from the windows. But there was nothing, only the empty expanse of the rural road. Years have passed since that harrowing experience, but the memory of the Whitmore house remains vivid in my mind. We eventually found peace in a new home, far from the haunted woods of Maine. But sometimes, on stormy nights, I catch a glimpse of shadowy figures in my peripheral vision, a haunting reminder that some places hold secrets best left undisturbed. The Whitmore house stands as a testament to the darkness that can fester in isolation, a place where history and horror intertwine. And while we moved on, the lessons learned from that night of respect, fear, and the unseen forces that dwell in forgotten corners continue to echo in the quiet moments of our lives. Story number 2. The shadow in the cornfield. I've always found solace in the vast expanses of the Kansas cornfields. There's something inherently calming about standing amidst the towering stalks, feeling the whisper of the wind through the leaves. and watching the horizon stretch endlessly into the distance. It was the perfect escape from the chaos of city life, a place where I could reconnect with nature and find peace in the simplicity of rural living. But peace is a fragile thing, easily shattered by the unseen and the unknown. My name is Jack Reynolds, and for the past 5 years, I've been running my family's farm, a modest yet thriving operation that has sustained us through good times and bad. My wife, Laura, and our 2 children, Emily and Tommy, have grown to love the rhythm of farm life as much as I do. We wake up with the sun, tend to the crops, and retire as the stars take their place in the night sky. It was during one of these tranquil evenings that everything changed. It was late September, and the harvest season was in full swing. The corn was tall and lush, swaying gently in the warm breeze. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the field, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the clouds tinged with gold. It was the kind of evening that made you appreciate the beauty of nature's simplicity. As I walked down the familiar path, the sounds of the farm crows cawing, the distant hum of tractors, created a soothing backdrop. But there was something different about tonight. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach, an inexplicable tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. That's when I saw him. A solitary figure stood in the middle of the cornfield, just beyond the reach of the fading light. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders and an imposing presence. His clothes were old-fashioned, an antiquated brown jacket and worn jeans that seemed out of place in the modern agricultural landscape. Most unsettling of all were his eyes, deep, hollow, and devoid of any warmth or life. They stared directly at me, piercing through the dimming light. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Questions raced through my mind. Who was he? Why was he here? The air around me seemed to grow colder, the rustling of the corn suddenly loud and foreboding. I took a hesitant step forward, then another, trying to make sense of the apparition before me. But as I moved closer, the figure began to shimmer, his form wavering like a mirage in the heat. Before I could react, he vanished, leaving me alone in the stillness of the twilight. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Laura and the kids would be wondering where I was by now. But the fear I felt kept me rooted to the spot. Shaking my head, I turned to head back home. But as I did, I noticed something odd. The rows of corn ahead of me had been bent into perfect circles, creating a strange, unnatural pattern that stood out against the otherwise orderly rows. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was as if someone or something had deliberately altered the landscape. Curiosity and unease pushed me forward. I approached the nearest circle, shining my flashlight into the center. There was nothing there, no sign of the figure I had seen earlier, just the neatly bent corn, the shadows dancing eerily in the fading light. I reached out to touch the stalks, but a sudden chill ran through me, and the feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance. That night, as I lay in bed, the events of the evening replayed in my mind like a broken record. The image of the hollow-eyed man and the circular corn rows haunted my thoughts, making it difficult to find rest. Laura noticed my restless state and gently stroked my hair, whispering reassurances that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But my imagination was far from innocent. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences became more frequent and unsettling. Every evening around dusk, I would catch glimpses of the shadowy figure standing amidst the corn, watching me with those empty eyes. Each time, he would vanish before I could get too close, leaving behind only the unnerving silence and the altered corn rows. Determined to uncover the truth, I began researching the history of our land. The farm had been in our family for generations, but records of the land's early days were sparse. Local archives and old newspapers yielded little information, until I stumbled upon a forgotten account of a man named Samuel Whitaker. Samuel Whitaker was a farmer who had lived on our land in the early 1900s. He was known to be a solitary figure, rarely seen by neighbors and often found working alone in his fields. But the most disturbing part of his story was the rumor that had circulated about him. Whispers of dark practices and accusations of witchcraft. According to local lore, Samuel had been a recluse who dabbled in forbidden rituals, seeking to control the natural forces of the land. The community had grown wary of him, leading to his eventual isolation and mysterious disappearance. Some said he had been driven mad by his experiments, while others believed he had been taken by the very forces he sought to command. His fate remained a mystery, a shadowy chapter in the history of our farm that no one dared to fully explore. As I delved deeper into Samuel's story, the connection between his rumored witchcraft and the strange phenomena on our farm became chillingly apparent. The circular corn rows and the apparition seemed like remnants of his unfinished work, a desperate attempt to harness the land's power that had left a lasting imprint on the soil and the shadows. One particularly stormy night, the same kind of tempest that had accompanied Samuel's supposed rituals, I decided to confront the haunting presence once and for all. Armed with only my flashlight and a deep sense of determination, I made my way into the cornfield at dusk, the air thick with anticipation and fear. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the field, I saw him again, the figure of Samuel Whitaker, his eyes still hollow and his presence as commanding as ever. This time, however, I felt a strange sense of purpose. "Samuel," I called out, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. "What do you want from me?" He remained silent, his gaze unwavering. I took a cautious step forward, trying to communicate through the fear that threatened to consume me. "I'm here to help you find peace. Let me know what you need." For a moment, nothing happened. The wind rustled through the corn, the storm intensifying around us. Then, Samuel raised his hand, pointing towards the center of a newly formed circle of corn. My heart raced as I approached, the ground beneath me feeling like it was pulsating with energy. In the center of the circle lay an old, weathered journal, Samuel's journal. No doubt, the key to unlocking the mystery that had bound his spirit to our land. I reached down, my fingers trembling as I picked it up, the pages brittle with age. As I began to read, the words revealed Samuel's desperate quest to control the land's natural energy, his experiments growing darker and more dangerous as he delved deeper into forbidden knowledge. His final entry spoke of a ritual intended to bind his spirit to the land, ensuring his legacy and control over the cornfields. But something had gone terribly wrong. The ritual had backfired, trapping his essence in a state of eternal unrest, forever wandering the fields in search of completion and redemption. Understanding dawned on me. Samuel's haunting was a result of his failed attempts to dominate nature, a cautionary tale about the dangers of meddling with forces beyond our comprehension. The circular corn rows were his way of maintaining control, a desperate attempt to keep his power contained and his spirit tethered to the earth. Determined to help Samuel find the peace he so desperately sought, I knew what needed to be done. I gathered the family and together, we performed a simple ritual of our own, honoring Samuel's memory, acknowledging his mistakes, and releasing him from his earthly bindings. As we chanted softly, the wind began to die down, the storm abating as if in response to our actions. The corn around us shimmered with a soft, ethereal light, and Samuel's apparition began to fade, his eyes now filled with a sense of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice echoing through the field one last time. "May you honor the land and keep its balance intact." With that, his presence vanished, leaving behind a serene stillness that settled over the cornfield. The circular rows slowly straightened, returning to their natural order as if Samuel's influence had been lifted from the land. In the weeks that followed, the haunting presence disappeared, and peace returned to our farm. The cornfields thrived more than ever, the air filled with the harmonious sounds of nature. The experience taught me a valuable lesson about respect and the delicate balance between humanity and the natural world. Sometimes, when the wind rustles through the corn and the sun sets in a blaze of color. I catch a glimpse of Samuel's figure standing at the edge of the field, a silent guardian watching over his land. It serves as a reminder of the past and the importance of honoring the forces that shape our world. Peace had been restored, but the memory of that shadowy figure and the mysteries of the cornfield would forever linger in my mind, a testament to the unseen and the unknown that coexist with our everyday lives. Story number 3. The abandoned school. I've always been fascinated by abandoned places, their silent stories and the lingering echoes of lives once lived within their walls. So when my friends Emily, Jake, Sophie, and Liam proposed exploring the old St. Bridget's School in rural Ireland, couldn't resist. The school had been deserted for over 30 years, ever since a devastating fire had claimed the lives of several students. Locals whispered about the tragedies and the restless spirits that supposedly haunted the grounds. But to us, it was the perfect adventure. We arrived on a chilly October evening, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple as the sun set behind the rolling hills. The drive through the countryside was picturesque, the landscape dotted with ancient stone walls and overgrown fields. As we approached the school, the building loomed before us, its once vibrant facade now crumbling, windows shattered, and ivy crawling up the sides like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. "Wow," Jake said, stepping out of the car and taking a deep breath. "It's even creepier in person." Emily nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Are we sure about this? I mean, what if something happens?" Sophie laughed nervously, her flashlight casting long shadows on the ground. "Come on. It's just an old building. Besides, it's not like there's anyone else around here." Liam, always the skeptic, shrugged. "Probably just rumors and ghost stories. Let's go check it out." We made our way to the entrance, the heavy wooden doors hanging off their hinges, swaying slightly in the cool breeze. Pushing the doors open, we stepped into the darkness, the musty scent of mold and decay assaulting our senses. The beam of Sophie's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing remnants of classrooms long abandoned, desks overturned, chalkboards scorched by fire, and personal belongings scattered across the floor. "Let's split up," Jake suggested, pointing to the map we had printed out earlier. "We can cover more ground this way." We agreed, deciding to meet back in the main hall in 30 minutes. I paired up with Emily, while Jake and Sophie took the northern wing, and Liam ventured into the gymnasium. As we walked through the corridors, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our footsteps echoing off the walls. Every creak and groan of the building seemed to amplify the tension, making our hearts race with each passing moment. "Do you feel that?" Emily whispered, her grip tightening around my arm. I nodded, my eyes scanning the darkened classrooms for any signs of movement. "Yeah, it's like the air is thick with something." We continued our exploration, eventually finding ourselves in what used to be the library. The room was vast, shelves of books now reduced to charred remains and blackened wood. We sat down on a fallen desk, trying to make sense of the eerie atmosphere. "Guys, over here," Emily called out softly, pointing towards a large, cracked window. "Look at this." We approached the window, and my breath caught in my throat. Outside, the vast cornfield stretched endlessly, illuminated by the faint light of the moon. But that's when I saw it. A fleeting shadow moving among the stalks, disappearing before we could get a clear view. "Did you see that?" I asked, turning to face Emily. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Yeah, it looked like a person." Before we could investigate further, a distant sound reached our ears, footsteps, running and splashing through the corridors. The noise was unsettling, as if someone or something was moving swiftly through the building. "Maybe someone else is here," Emily suggested, her voice trembling. I shook my head. "No way, it's been abandoned for decades." As if on cue, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the halls. a haunting reminder of the lives lost in the fire. The laughter was distant, yet it filled the space with an eerie presence that made my skin crawl. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. I agreed, and we hurried back to the main hall, retracing our steps through the labyrinthine corridors. Just as we reached the entrance, a cold gust of wind swept through the building, extinguishing our flashlights and plunging us into darkness. "Guys, do you have a light?" I called out, my voice echoing back at me. Silence. Panic set in as we fumbled to relight our flashlights, the beam cutting through the darkness once more. As the lights flickered back to life, I noticed something odd. Rows of corn stalks outside the broken windows were bent into perfect circles, an unnatural pattern that stood out against the chaotic layout of the abandoned school. "What the hell is that?" Emily asked, pointing towards the windows. Before I could respond, I heard a soft whisper, like distant voices carried on the wind. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of indistinct murmurs that filled the room with an oppressive weight. Suddenly, one of the windows shattered inward, the glass raining down around us as a shadowy figure appeared in the doorway. It was a boy, his face pale and eyes hollow, staring directly at us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Who are you?" I demanded, stepping forward despite the fear gripping me. The boy didn't respond. Instead, he raised his hand, pointing towards the upper floors of the school. Before we could react, he vanished, leaving behind only the lingering fear and the sound of our racing hearts. "We need to leave now," I insisted, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her towards the exit. As we ran through the corridors, the atmosphere grew heavier, the whispers turning into anguished cries that echoed through the building. Every step felt like a struggle against an invisible force pushing us back, making our escape seem impossible. Finally, we burst through the front doors, the cool night air hitting our faces as we sprinted towards the car. As we reached the driveway, I glanced back, my eyes catching a glimpse of the boy's reflection in the shattered windows. He stood at the top of the stairs, staring down at us with a sorrowful expression before disappearing into the darkness. We didn't stop until we were safely back in the car, hearts pounding and minds reeling from the night's terrifying events. As we drove away, the abandoned school faded into the distance, but the fear and the haunting images stayed with us, a constant reminder of the lives lost and the restless spirits that still lingered within its walls. In the days that followed, we tried to rationalize what we had experienced. Jake and Sophie dismissed it as a combination of adrenaline and the power of suggestion, while Liam remained skeptical but intrigued by the historical accounts of the fire. Emily, however, was deeply affected, her once adventurous spirit now tinged with a lingering fear of the unknown. Determined to understand the truth behind the haunting, I delved into the history of St. Bridget's School. The fire had occurred on a chilly November night, claiming the lives of 5 students and leaving the building in ruins. The community had mourned the loss, but there were whispers of dark forces at play, rumors that the fire wasn't entirely accidental, and that the spirits of the lost children remained trapped within the school's decaying walls. One evening, unable to shake the memories of that night, I decided to return to the school alone. Armed with a flashlight and a notebook, I made my way through the now peaceful fields, the moon casting a silver glow over the abandoned building. The doors were firmly shut, but I managed to find a small window that had not been boarded up. Slipping inside to explore further, the interior was even more desolate than before, the remnants of the fire scattered throughout the halls. I wandered through the classrooms, the silence heavy with unspoken sorrow. As I approached the library, the same whispers began to fill the air, growing louder as I stepped into the room. The bookshelves were charred and broken, but in the center of the room stood a circle of untouched books, their pages fluttering as if moved by an unseen force. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and I felt a presence behind me. Turning slowly, I faced the boy from before, his eyes now filled with a desperate plea. "Help us," he whispered, his voice echoing through the room. I approached him cautiously, my heart aching with empathy. "What do you need me to do?" He pointed towards the old gymnasium, his form wavering like a reflection in disturbed water. "Find the truth. Set us free." Determined to help, I followed his direction, making my way through the dimly lit halls until I reached the gymnasium. The room was vast, the remnants of sports equipment scattered across the floor. In the center stood an old podium, now charred and broken. As I approached, I noticed a faded photograph on the podium, a picture of the 5 students who had perished in the fire, their smiles frozen in time. Understanding dawned on me. The spirits were trapped by the unresolved tragedy, their anguish binding them to the place of their untimely deaths. I vowed to honor their memory and help them find peace. I spent the next few weeks gathering information, speaking with locals, and piecing together the events leading up to the fire. It became clear that the incident had been a cover-up, a desperate attempt to hide the truth behind the flames. The students had been performing a ritual, seeking to connect with something beyond their understanding. But something had gone horribly wrong, resulting in the fire that consumed them all. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the school one last time, determined to perform a ritual of my own to release the trapped spirits. Under the light of a full moon, I stood in the gymnasium, the photograph of the students laid out before me. I spoke the words I had discovered, my voice steady despite the fear that lingered in my heart. As I finished the incantation, a warm light enveloped the room, the shadows dissipating as the spirits found their release. The boys and girls from the photograph appeared, their faces serene and grateful, before fading into the night, leaving behind a sense of peace that had long been absent. The next morning, the school stood silent and still. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. The cornfields returned to their natural state, the circles of bent stalks a mere memory. I left the school with a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that I had helped heal the wounds of the past and set the spirits free. Years have passed since that fateful night, and the old St. Bridget's School remains a quiet relic of history, its dark secrets finally laid to rest. My friends and I have long moved on, but the memories of our adventure and the lives we touched linger on, a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring presence of those who seek peace. Sometimes, when the wind rustles through the cornfields and the sun sets in a blaze of color, I catch a glimpse of shadowy figures standing at the edge of the field, their presence a silent reminder of the lives lost and the spirits we helped find their way home. It serves as a haunting reminder that some places hold stories that transcend time, waiting for someone to listen and offer a helping hand. Story number 4. The Silent Forest. I've always been a man of the woods. Growing up in the rural heartlands of Sweden, the forest was my playground, my sanctuary, and my teacher. The towering pines and dense underbrush held secrets that only the most patient and curious could uncover. So when the locals warned me about the silent forest, a place where not a single bird song or insect chirp disturbed the unnatural silence, I dismissed their fears as old wives' tales meant to keep people away. But curiosity got the better of me. It was late October when I decided to explore the silent forest. The air was crisp, and the leaves had already begun their vibrant transformation, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Armed with my hunting rifle, a flashlight, and a sturdy backpack, I set out just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The entrance to the silent forest was marked by an ancient, gnarled oak tree, its branches twisted like skeletal fingers reaching out to the sky. As I stepped beneath its canopy, the world outside seemed to fade away, replaced by an eerie stillness that pressed down on me. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Only the sound of my footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves echoed through the vast expanse of trees. I walked deeper into the forest, the darkness enveloping me like a heavy blanket. My flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing glimpses of the dense foliage and the occasional glimpse of wildlife scurrying away at my approach. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the silence became. as if the forest itself was holding its breath. After hours of trekking, I found myself in a clearing bathed in the pale light of the full moon. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I decided to set up camp for the night, hoping to catch some game in the early morning. As I unpacked my gear, a chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I sat by the small fire I had built, its flames flickering and casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. The night was cold, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, staring into the fire and trying to dispel the unease that settled over me. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the edge of the clearing. I strained my ears, trying to identify the source of the noise. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the underbrush. My heart began to race as I grabbed my rifle, instinctively reaching for the safety. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could make out the unmistakable sound of someone moving through the forest. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense with anticipation. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the clearing was plunged into absolute silence. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged, a man, dressed in old-fashioned hunting gear, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. There was something unsettling about him, an aura of sadness and desperation that seemed to emanate from his very presence. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. He didn't respond. Instead, he took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. I could feel his gaze upon me, piercing through the darkness. Then, without warning, he turned and began to walk deeper into the forest, his figure blending seamlessly with the shadows. I hesitated for a moment, torn between the instinct to follow and the fear of what lay ahead. But something compelled me to move, to understand the mystery that had drawn me into the silent forest. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, and followed him into the depths of the woods. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew denser, the air colder, and the silence more oppressive. Every snap of a twig underfoot and every rustle of leaves made my heart race with anxiety. The man led me to a small clearing, where an old, abandoned cabin stood, a relic from a bygone era, its windows shattered and doors hanging off their hinges. He entered the cabin, and I followed, the door creaking ominously as it swung open. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, filled with the remnants of lives long forgotten. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the corners like ghostly drapes. In the center of the room stood a single chair, facing a large, cracked mirror on the far wall. The man walked over to the mirror, his reflection distorted by the grime and age. He stared into it for a long moment before turning to face me. His eyes were hollow, devoid of any emotion, and his mouth was set in a firm line of determination. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Leave now, before it's too late." I took a step back, feeling a surge of fear. "What's going on? Who are you?" He shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "This place holds darkness, secrets that should never be uncovered. You're too late to turn back." Before I could respond, the room began to change. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the air grew thick with an oppressive force. Shadows danced along the edges of my vision, and whispers filled the space, voices from the past crying out in anguish. I felt a presence behind me, cold and unrelenting. Turning, I saw faceless figures standing in the corners of the room, their forms shifting and changing, never settling into anything concrete. The man reached out towards me, his hand passing through my shoulder like smoke. "You have to leave," he pleaded, his voice now tinged with desperation. "Before the darkness consumes you too." I turned and ran, the cabin now a labyrinth of twisting corridors and oppressive shadows that seemed to reach out to trap me. The forest outside had come alive, the trees groaning and swaying as if alive. their branches clawing at me in a futile attempt to pull me back. I stumbled through the maze, the whispers growing louder, turning into screams of pain and terror. Every step felt like a struggle against an unseen force, pushing me deeper into the heart of the silent forest. The man's warning echoed in my mind, a haunting refrain that I couldn't escape. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst out of the cabin and into the open clearing. The storm had intensified, lightning illuminating the sky in jagged flashes and thunder shaking the very ground beneath my feet. I sprinted through the cornfields, the rain pelting my face and soaking my clothes, the oppressive silence of the forest now replaced by the fury of the storm. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I glanced back, my breath ragged and my heart pounding. The cabin stood silent once more, the man and the faceless figures gone, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't stop running until I was safely back in my truck, driving away from the silent forest with the storm raging behind me. The next day, shaken and sleep-deprived, I decided to investigate further. I reached out to the locals, hoping to find answers about the silent forest and the man I had encountered. An old farmer named Henrik agreed to meet me, his eyes clouded with memories. "St. Elmo's Forest," Henrik began, his voice low and gravelly. "It's been avoided by everyone for decades. They say the spirits of those who ventured in never returned. The forest takes something from those who disrespect its boundaries." I listened intently, the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. The man I had met was likely one of the lost souls, a guardian of the forest's dark secrets, trying to warn me away from the malevolent forces that resided within. Determined to respect the boundaries of the silent forest and to find peace from the haunting experience, I decided to leave the area, vowing never to return. But the memory of that night lingered, a constant reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead, and the darkness that hides in the silence of the woods. Years have passed since that harrowing experience, but sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees and the rain begins to fall, I can almost hear the whispers of the silent forest, a haunting reminder that some places are meant to remain untouched, their secrets forever hidden in the shadows. Story number 5. The Song from the Swamp. I've always been drawn to the mysteries that linger in the shadows of small towns. Growing up in Bayou Hollow, Louisiana, I learned early on that every creek, tree, and misty night held its own secrets. But nothing could have prepared me for the haunting melody that echoed from the depths of the nearby swamp, a tune so sorrowful it seemed to pierce the very soul. Bayou Hollow was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and the rhythms of life were as predictable as the seasons. The swamp, however, was different. It was a vast, murky expanse that stretched beyond the horizon, a labyrinth of reeds and cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. Locals called it Old Man Marsh, a name steeped in folklore and fear. They said it was alive, breathing with the memories of those who had vanished within its tangled embrace. The first time I heard the song, it was a humid August evening. I was sitting on my porch, sipping a glass of sweet tea, when the melody floated through the air like a ghostly whisper. It was a woman's voice, clear and melancholic, singing a lullaby that seemed both ancient and achingly familiar. The sound was mesmerizing, pulling me toward the edge of the swamp where the trees stood tall and silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that the song was calling to me, urging me to uncover its source. As days turned into weeks, the singing became a nightly ritual, playing softly under the cloak of fog and rain. My curiosity grew alongside my unease, and I began to spend my evenings watching the swamp, hoping to catch a glimpse of the elusive singer. One stormy night, the rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the roads to mud and the swamp into a roaring sea of darkness. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the swamp in stark, fleeting flashes. I sat on my porch, staring into the swirling mist, when the song began again, louder and more desperate than ever. This time, I felt an undeniable urge to follow it, without fully understanding why. I grabbed my raincoat and ventured into the storm, the melody guiding me deeper into Old Man Marsh. The rain pounded against my face, each drop a testament to the tempest raging above. The swamp was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures silenced by the downpour. All that existed was the haunting song, leading me further into the heart of darkness. As I pushed through the thick reeds, the ground squelched beneath my boots, and the air grew colder, filled with the scent of earth and decay. The song grew clearer, more defined, as if the woman was right beside me, her presence palpable in the oppressive gloom. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and fascination driving me forward. Suddenly, the song stopped. I stood in the middle of the swamp, drenched and shivering, my breath visible in the cold night air. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. I turned to retrace my steps, but the path back was obscured by the relentless rain and swirling fog. Panic set in as I realized I was lost, swallowed by the very swamp I had sought to understand. Desperate to find my way, I stumbled through the darkness, the memories of the song haunting my every step. Hours seemed to pass, each moment stretching into eternity. Just as exhaustion threatened to overcome me, I saw a faint light flickering through the trees, a broken porch light from an abandoned shack. Perhaps, relief surged through me, and I quickened my pace, hoping to find shelter and a way out. As I approached the shack, the light dimmed, and the air grew thick with a sense of foreboding. The door hung loosely on its hinges, swaying gently in the wind. I pushed it open, stepping into the dilapidated interior. The room was empty, save for the remnants of a forgotten life, dusty furniture, cracked windows, and faded photographs that stared blankly from the walls. I sank to the floor, catching my breath, when the door slammed shut behind me with a force that sent chills down my spine. The temperature dropped sharply, and the oppressive silence returned. Heavier than before, my flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced across the room. Panic clawed at me as I tried to find an exit, but the door refused to budge. Then, the song began again, softer this time, filled with sorrow and longing. I followed the sound to a corner of the room, where an old mirror stood covered in grime. As I wiped away the dirt, the reflection that stared back at me wasn't my own. There stood a woman in a tattered dress, her eyes hollow and filled with unspeakable pain. She raised a hand, her fingers trembling as they reached out toward me. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm outside. "I'm trapped here, forever singing my sorrow." I recoiled in fear, the image of her face seared into my mind. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice shaking. She gestured toward the swamp, her expression pleading. "Find the truth. Release me from this eternal sorrow." Before I could respond, the room began to distort, the walls stretching and twisting as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The mirror cracked, shards of glass raining down around me, and the sound of the song grew louder, more insistent. The woman's figure faded, replaced by the overwhelming presence of the swamp's darkness. I bolted from the shack, the door slamming shut behind me once more. The rain intensified, the swamp alive with the echoes of lost souls and forgotten songs. I ran blindly through the mire, the haunting melody chasing me, refusing to let go. Every step felt like an eternity, the weight of the swamp pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Just as I thought I couldn't run any further, the storm began to subside, the rain easing to a gentle drizzle. The mist lifted, revealing a familiar path that led back to the edge of the swamp. Exhausted and trembling, I made my way home, the haunting song still echoing in my ears like a ghostly lament. The next morning, word spread quickly through Bayou Hollow about my disappearance and the terrifying ordeal I had endured. The locals were no strangers to the legends of Old Man Marsh, but hearing firsthand accounts only deepened their fears. They spoke of the woman's song, a mournful tune that lured the curious and the brave into the swamp, never to return. Determined to uncover the truth behind the haunting melody, I began researching the history of Old Man Marsh. I discovered that many years ago, a woman named Eliza Hart had vanished without a trace while exploring the swamp. Rumors abounded that she had been accused of witchcraft by the superstitious townsfolk, forced into isolation, and ultimately lost to the darkness of the marsh. Her disappearance had remained a mystery, a story of tragedy and injustice that the townspeople preferred to forget. But her spirit, it seemed, had found a way to linger, her sorrowful song a beacon for those who dared to seek answers. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the swamp, determined to bring peace to Eliza's restless spirit. I navigated through the dense reeds and shadowed paths, the memory of her song guiding me deeper into the heart of Old Man Marsh. The air was thick with anticipation, every rustle and snap of a twig heightening my senses. Finally, I reached a clearing where the swamp opened up to reveal a hidden pond, its surface still and reflective under the moonlight. In the center stood a stone marker, weathered by time and covered in moss, a memorial to those who had lost their lives in the swamp's unforgiving embrace. I knelt beside it, placing a bouquet of wildflowers I had gathered, a silent offering of peace. "Eliza," I called out softly, my voice carrying the weight of my intent. "I know your story. I'm here to help you find peace." The air grew colder, and the mist swirled around me as the haunting melody began once more. But this time, it was different, filled with hope and gratitude rather than sorrow and desperation. The song wrapped around me like a gentle embrace, soothing my fears and filling me with a sense of purpose. A figure began to materialize before me, her form clearer and more serene than before. Eliza Hart stood there, her eyes no longer hollow but filled with a gentle light. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a harmonious blend of relief and contentment. "You've freed me from my sorrow." As her presence dissolved into the night air, the swamp seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the oppressive darkness lifting to reveal the beauty and tranquility beneath. The song faded, replaced by the natural sounds of the swamp reclaiming its peace. I stood up, a profound sense of accomplishment and calm washing over me. Eliza's spirit had found the closure she so desperately needed, and the haunting melody that had plagued Bayou Hollow for so long was finally silenced. The swamp, once a place of fear and mystery, had transformed into a symbol of redemption and the enduring power of compassion. Returning to the village, I shared my story, hoping to bring healing to those who had been touched by the swamp's dark legacy. The townspeople listened, their fears easing as they understood that Eliza Hart was no longer a restless spirit, but a soul finally at peace. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the fog rolls in and the swamp breathes with the memories of the past, I still hear a faint echo of Eliza's song, a gentle reminder that some spirits never truly fade, but find solace in the hearts of those who listen. Bayou Hollow remains a place where the past and present intertwine, where the whispers of lost souls are honored and remembered. And as I sit on my porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I know that the swamp song has been rewritten, a melody of peace, hope, and the enduring bond between the living and the departed. Story number 6. The Woman by the Road. I've driven those desolate Texas highways countless times, the endless stretches of asphalt disappearing into the horizon under the vast, star-studded sky. The isolation of the open road has always been my solace, a time to reflect and find peace amidst the hum of my truck's engine. But that midnight drive changed everything, leaving an indelible mark on my soul that I still grapple with to this day. It was a typical Friday night in late October when the incident occurred. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and the promise of an impending storm. I was hauling freight from Houston to Amarillo, navigating the familiar route through the heart of Texas. The road was quiet, the only sounds being the steady rhythm of the tires on the pavement and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. As I approached a particularly remote stretch of highway, the moon was obscured by thick, rolling clouds, casting an eerie darkness over the landscape. The windshield wipers struggled against the light drizzle that had started earlier, creating a rhythmic swish that matched my thoughts. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Midnight. That's when I saw her. A woman stood by the roadside, her silhouette outlined against the dimly lit highway. She was clad in a long, flowing dress that seemed out of place in the late-night Texas weather, the fabric billowing gently in the breeze. Her hair was dark and tangled, partially obscuring her face, but her presence was undeniable. She raised a hand, signaling for a ride. I felt a chill run down my spine. Normally, I wouldn't stop for a hitchhiker, especially not in such an isolated area. But something about her posture, her silent plea made me hesitate. I pulled over to the side, the engine idling as I rolled down the window. "Need a ride somewhere?" I called out, my voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. She nodded slowly, stepping closer to the truck. As she approached, the rain intensified, the droplets splattering against the window with renewed vigor. I reached out to open the passenger door, but just as I did, she vanished. One moment she was standing there, and the next, she was gone, leaving behind only the sound of the storm and the fading silhouette in my rearview mirror. Shaken, I rubbed my temples, trying to rationalize what I had just witnessed. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or a mirage brought on by exhaustion. But as I continued driving, I couldn't shake the image of her disappearing act. My mind raced with questions. Who was she? Why did she disappear so suddenly? A few miles down the road, my unease grew. There she was again, standing a few miles ahead, still signaling as if she was waiting for someone. This time, I made the decision to stop, though part of me resisted the urge. Pulling over once more, I approached the window cautiously. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She remained silent, her eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before she turned away. I hesitated, then decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. "Where are you headed?" I inquired, but she didn't respond. Instead, she continued to stand there, her figure beginning to fade once more. Before I could react, she vanished again, leaving me alone in the pouring rain. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat back in the truck, trying to make sense of the inexplicable events. Determined to regain my composure, I started the engine and resumed my journey. The road seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the storm showing no signs of abating. The rain had intensified, creating a curtain of water that blurred the landscape around me. I focused on the road ahead, trying to push the haunting image of the woman from my mind. But fate has a way of intertwining itself with the most ordinary moments. And as I rounded a bend in the highway, I saw her again. This time, she was standing directly in front of my truck, her figure solid and unmistakable. Panic surged through me as I realized there was no way she could have walked that distance in the limited time between my stops. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt just inches away from her. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at her, trying to comprehend the impossibility of the situation. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to pierce through my very being. Without a word, she turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the darkness of the storm. Heart racing, I sat back in the truck, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I knew I should leave immediately, but something compelled me to stay, to understand why she kept appearing and disappearing like a ghostly apparition. I decided to follow her, tracking her movements through the labyrinth of rain-soaked roads and winding highways. The pursuit led me deeper into the night, the road growing narrower and more treacherous as the storm raged on. The woman moved with an otherworldly grace, her figure illuminated intermittently by the lightning flashes that split the sky. I drove cautiously, my headlights cutting through the darkness. But every time I thought I was gaining on her, she would vanish, leaving me with nothing but the pounding rain and my own racing thoughts. Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of relenting. Exhaustion set in, but my determination to uncover the mystery kept me moving forward. Just as I was about to lose hope, I saw a faint light through the rain, a dilapidated gas station that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I decided to make a stop, hoping to find shelter and maybe some answers. As I pulled into the rundown gas station, the storm began to subside, the rain tapering off to a gentle drizzle. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a dim glow over the deserted pumps and cracked windows. I parked the truck and approached the building, my footsteps echoing on the gravel driveway. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of old oil and mildew. I approached the counter, hoping to find someone who could explain the woman I had been chasing. To my surprise, an old man sat behind the counter, his eyes heavy with fatigue and his expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gravelly from years of smoke and silence. I hesitated, unsure of how to broach the subject. "I saw someone out on the road, a woman in a long dress, signaling for a ride. She disappeared when I stopped." The old man's eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition passing through them. "You mean Miss Eleanor?" he replied slowly. "Eleanor," I echoed, puzzled. "Who is she?" The man sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Miss Eleanor was a resident of this area many years ago. She was a kind woman, always willing to help others. But one stormy night, she disappeared without a trace while walking home from the market. Some say she was taken by the spirits of the swamp, unable to find her way back." I felt a chill run down my spine. "So, she's the one I've been seeing? Why is she still here?" The old man shook his head. "There are those who believe that Eleanor's spirit lingers, forever searching for her lost way home. Some say she appears to those who are lost or in need of guidance, but never for long." Before I could ask more, a faint sound drew my attention, a soft, sorrowful melody drifting through the open window. It was the same haunting song I had heard earlier, now filled with a sense of longing and despair. "Eleanor's song," the old man murmured. "It's said to be her way of reaching out, trying to communicate with the living, but she remains trapped, unable to break free from the sorrow that binds her to this world. Determined to help, I knew I had to find a way to release her spirit." The old man handed me a faded photograph of a young woman in a similar dress, her eyes filled with kindness and sadness. "She was deeply loved by everyone who knew her," he said softly. "If you can help her find peace, perhaps her spirit can finally rest." Armed with this newfound knowledge, I left the gas station and returned to my truck, the photograph burning a hole in my pocket. The night was still, the storm now a distant memory, but the haunting melody lingered in my ears, urging me to take action. I decided to visit the site where Eleanor had disappeared, a dense section of the swamp known for its treacherous terrain and eerie silence. As I navigated the narrow paths, the moonlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, casting long, distorted shadows across the marshy ground. The air was heavy with humidity, the sounds of nocturnal creatures muffled by the thick foliage. Finally, I reached a small clearing, the remnants of a worn dirt path leading into the heart of the swamp. The water was still, reflecting the pale light of the moon, and the silence was almost tangible. I held the photograph tightly, feeling a surge of empathy and determination. "Eleanor," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the gentle lapping of the water. "I know you're out there. I'm here to help you find your way home." A soft breeze rustled the leaves, and the haunting melody began once more, blending seamlessly with the sounds of the swamp. I followed the sound, my footsteps careful on the uneven ground, until I reached the edge of the water. There, just beyond the reach of the light, I saw her, Miss Eleanor, standing at the water's edge, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of hope and sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice like a distant echo. "You've come to help me." I reached out, holding the photograph up towards her. "I want to help you find peace, Eleanor. Let me guide you home." She approached, her form shimmering in the moonlight, and took the photograph from my hand. As she gazed at it, a serene smile graced her lips, and a sense of calm washed over the clearing. The oppressive darkness that had once bound her seemed to lift, replaced by a gentle warmth that enveloped us both. With a final, grateful nod, Eleanor began to fade, her spirit finally finding the release it had long sought. The haunting melody ceased, replaced by the soothing sounds of the swamp waking up as dawn approached. As the first light of morning broke through the trees, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment and peace. Eleanor's spirit was free, her sorrow lifted, and the silent forest of Texas regained its tranquility. Driving back to civilization, the memory of that night lingered, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the thin veil that separates the living from the dead. I often find myself staring out the windshield at the empty highways, wondering if I'll ever see Eleanor again. But I take comfort in knowing that sometimes the most haunting mysteries are solved not through fear, but through understanding and a willingness to help those who can no longer help themselves. Bayou Hollow and its silent forest may hold countless secrets, but that midnight encounter reminded me that some spirits seek nothing more than a guiding hand to lead them home. And in those quiet, desolate moments, when the road stretches endlessly before me, I feel a connection to something greater, a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, there is hope for redemption and peace. Story number 7. The Abandoned Windmill. I've always been drawn to the stories whispered by old buildings and forgotten places. Growing up in the picturesque countryside of Bavaria, Germany, the landscape was dotted with charming farms, serene meadows, and the occasional relic of a bygone era. But among all these, there was one place that stood out, a decrepit windmill perched on the outskirts of our village. Known simply as Der Verlassene Mulrad, or the Abandoned Windmill. The windmill had been silent for decades, its sails motionless against the backdrop of endless skies. Locals avoided it, especially after sundown, recounting eerie tales of inexplicable sounds and strange sightings. They spoke of nights when the windmill seemed to come alive, its gears turning and creaking despite the absence of wind. Some even claimed to see a figure with glowing red eyes lurking in the shadows, manipulating the very mechanism that had long ceased to function. As a teenager with a penchant for adventure and a healthy dose of skepticism, I couldn't resist the allure of uncovering the truth behind these tales. My name is Lucas Muller, and this is the story of the night I confronted the legend of the abandoned windmill. It was a crisp autumn evening, the air tinged with the scent of fallen leaves and impending rain. The sky was a canvas of deep purples and oranges as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village. My friends Hans, Greta, and Maria had long shared my fascination with the windmill, but it was I who proposed the daring exploration that would change everything. "Come on, Lucas," Hans urged, his voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. "We've heard the stories. It's time we see it for ourselves." Greta and Maria exchanged nervous glances before nodding in agreement. The prospect of unraveling the mystery was too enticing to ignore. Equipped with flashlights, backpacks, and a sense of youthful bravado, we set out towards the windmill just as darkness began to settle. The path to the windmill was narrow and overgrown, flanked by tall grasses that swayed gently in the evening breeze. As we approached, the silhouette of the windmill loomed against the darkening sky, its once grand structure now marred by neglect and decay. The sails, though still, cast long, ominous shadows that danced eerily in the fading light. "We should split up," Greta suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "Cover more ground and meet back here in 30 minutes. I hesitated, the rational part of my mind urging caution. "Are you sure that's a good idea? What if something happens?" Hans shrugged, a dismissive gesture that belied his nervousness. "We'll be fine. Let's just get this over with." With that, we divided into pairs, Hans and Greta taking the eastern wing, Maria and I the western. The decision to split up felt reckless, but the thrill of the unknown propelled us forward. Maria and I ventured deeper into the windmill, the wooden floors creaking under our weight. The interior was a labyrinth of narrow passages and shadowed corners. The air thick with the musty scent of mildew and decay. Our flashlights flickered, casting unsettling patterns on the peeling wallpaper and broken windows. "Did you hear that?" Maria whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I strained to listen, but the only sound was the steady drip of water from a leaky roof. "Probably just the wind," I replied, though the unease gnawed at me. We made our way to the main chamber, the heart of the windmill where the gears and mechanisms once worked in harmony with nature's breath. The room was vast, the towering machinery now rusted and silent, a testament to years of neglect. As I examined the broken gears, a sudden chill swept through the room, and the temperature seemed to drop sharply. "Lucas," Maria called softly, her voice trembling. "I think we should go back." Before I could respond, a distant, rhythmic clanking echoed through the windmill, as if the gears were stirring to life. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. "Did you hear that?" Maria nodded, her grip tightening on my arm. "We need to leave. Now." We turned to make our way back, but the path had changed. The once familiar corridors twisted and warped, leading us deeper into the bowels of the windmill rather than towards the exit. Panic set in as we realized we were lost, trapped within the very structure we had sought to explore. "Stay calm," I urged, trying to steady my breathing. "We need to find another way out." As we navigated the disorienting passages, the clanking grew louder, more insistent, reverberating through the walls like the heartbeat of the windmill itself. Shadows danced menacingly in the corners of our vision, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the sounds of our own footsteps and the eerie clanking. Suddenly, the clanking ceased, replaced by a soft, melodic humming that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The sound was both beautiful and haunting, sending shivers down my spine. "What is that?" Maria asked, her voice barely audible. Before I could respond, the humming transformed into a chilling melody, the unmistakable tune of a woman's lullaby, sweet yet sorrowful. The source of the sound became apparent as a faint light flickered ahead, drawing us towards a narrow doorway. "Maybe it's one of the others," I suggested, the hope of reuniting with Hans and Greta spurring me forward. We approached the doorway cautiously, the melody growing louder and more defined. Peeking inside, we found ourselves in a small, dimly lit room, the control center of the windmill. Ancient maps and diagrams adorned the walls, and the central gear mechanism stood before us, seemingly untouched by time. But it was the figure in the corner that stole my breath away. A woman stood there, her back to us, bathed in the pale light. Her hair flowed like liquid midnight, and she wore a tattered dress that seemed to shimmer with an ethereal glow. Slowly, she turned to face us, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes were pools of burning red, glowing with an intensity that seemed to pierce through my very soul. "Why have you come?" she asked, her voice a haunting melody that resonated with sorrow and anger. I took a step back, my mind racing to comprehend the apparition before me. "We didn't mean any harm," I stammered. "We were just curious about the windmill." She let out a soft, mournful sigh, her expression shifting from anger to deep sadness. "This place is cursed. The windmill's heart beats with the sorrow of those who lost their way." Maria clutched my arm tightly, her eyes wide with fear. "Who are you? What happened here?" The woman's gaze softened, and she began to recount the tragic history of the windmill. "Many years ago, this windmill was the pride of our village, provided power and hope, a symbol of progress. But one fateful night, a terrible storm struck, stronger than any we had ever seen. The winds tore through the village, and the windmill, unable to withstand the fury, collapsed, trapping me and many others inside. We were lost, our souls bound to this place, forever yearning for release." Tears welled up in her eyes as she continued. "I am Anna, one of those who perished that night. The windmill's gears turned not with wind, but with the anguish of our trapped spirits. We are unable to move on. our sorrow keeping us tethered to this forsaken place. A sense of compassion washed over me, overpowering the fear that had held me in its grip. Is there anything we can do to help you? To free you from this curse? Anna looked at me with a mixture of hope and desperation. Find the heart of the windmill, restore balance, and you may grant us the peace we seek. Determined to assist, I vowed to uncover the secrets that bound Anna and her fellow spirits to the windmill. We'll do whatever it takes, I promised, the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. The woman nodded, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes before she began to fade, her presence dissolving into the shadows. Thank you, she whispered, her voice echoing through the room as the windmill seemed to sigh in relief. Maria and I set out to fulfill Anna's request, our minds focused on finding the heart of the windmill. The journey was fraught with challenges, hidden passages, shifting corridors, and lingering apparitions that tested our resolve. But the bond formed in that haunted windmill fueled our determination, driving us forward through the darkness. Finally, we reached the central chamber, the heart of the windmill where the gears once spun with life. The machinery was frozen in time, the central gear immobile and covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. As we approached, the air grew heavy with anticipation, the silence almost deafening. Here it is, I whispered, placing my hand on the cold metal. Gathering our courage, we began the task of restoring the windmill's heart. I cleaned the gears, removing years of neglect, while Maria and I worked together to realign the mechanisms. It was painstaking work, each movement deliberate and precise, driven by the hope of freeing the trapped souls. As the final gear clicked into place, a surge of energy pulsed through the windmill. The machinery began to move, the gears turning smoothly and harmoniously. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of calm and peace that filled the room. Anna's spirit appeared once more, her form now radiant and serene. You've done it, she whispered, her eyes reflecting gratitude and tranquility. Thank you for setting us free. A brilliant light enveloped the windmill, and I felt a profound sense of accomplishment and relief. The restless spirits had found their peace, their anguish finally laid to rest. The windmill, once a symbol of tragedy, now stood as a beacon of hope and redemption. As we left the windmill, the first light of dawn breaking through the clouds, I knew that the legend of the abandoned windmill had been transformed. The villagers, once fearful and wary, welcomed us with newfound respect and gratitude, their stories now filled with tales of courage and compassion. But the memory of that night remained etched in my mind, a haunting reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead, and the enduring power of empathy to heal even the deepest wounds. Sometimes, when the wind whispers through the fields and the morning mist dances on the horizon, I can still hear Anna's lullaby, a sweet melody that now sings of peace and closure. Bayou Hollow and its abandoned windmill had taught me that some places hold secrets that demand respect, and that understanding and kindness can bridge the gap between worlds. And as I continue to drive through the serene countryside, I carry with me the lessons learned from that haunted night, forever changed by the spirits who found their way home.